My name's Richard Sutton, and we have kind of a special Hyde lecture today in that it's a collaborative lecture with the Big Ideas seminar that's been held this semester. And the focus has been on scenery as a natural resource. And we have a speaker here today that's going to put more of an urban twist on it. So let me introduce our speaker. Ron Fleming is a planner. He completed his undergraduate work at Pomona College in California, and because of some changes in his backyard or nearby when he was a young boy, he became interested in the built environment. And he went to the Harvard Graduate School of Design and got involved in the ground floor of the Main Street movement, which looked at how small towns deal with their commercial districts and so forth. He's become an expert on placemaking, written several books. I think your last book was out in 2007. And he's going to talk with us today about a Scenic Manifesto for communities. One other thing I need to mention is he's also the chairman of Scenic America, which, if you're not familiar with that organization, has done a yeoman's job in keeping our urban and rural landscapes free of clutter, particularly billboards. And we've got lots of beautiful open space in Nebraska, but unfortunately some of it has been cluttered up with billboards. So he has a unique kind of perspective on the ways of dealing with that in terms of policy and legal and so forth. So without further ado, I'd like to have you welcome Ron Fleming.
Thank you. Well, it's nice to be here. This is my first full day in Nebraska, and I'm enjoying it very much. I discovered that one of my ancestors was a mayor here in 1933, so it's been a morning of revelation. So the visual environment has gotten less attention, I think, than air and water and noise pollution. I think because there were more scientific ways of measuring those qualities. And in a nation that was full of energy and development pressure, lots of times the scenic environment was the kind of junior sister to those other environmental issues and wasn't dealt with as effectively. Scenic America tries to monitor some of the visual pollution and to do something about it. It is both a research group and a lobbying group in Washington that fights against the big billboard companies and has had some success when it gets to the courts. But I think that's probably the weakest area of the visual environment in terms of being able to make changes. And one of the things I want to do today is to explore a number of the aspects of the visual environment and sort of assess how we're doing in some of those different areas, and then look at a set of principles, of 7 principles for scenic conservation, and discuss those. The rise of the scenics is a phenomena of our time. There are now a series of these organizations around the country, and they meet each year together and trade war stories and experiences. Here's a map showing the ones that existed as of April 2012. And we have meetings, usually one in Washington each year, and then a meeting hosted by a scenic organization somewhere else. You can see there are more in the West and the East than there are in the Middle West. I hope that's an incentive for people here to join the rising number of these organizations. And they really follow a kind of pattern of concern about the visual environment. What I want to do is start by kind of giving you that context of where we've come in this area of visual values. One of the distinctive features of American cities and towns, particularly those of the New England sort, which then followed across the country into Ohio, were the village greens and commons. They're some of the first cared for spaces in American cities and towns. And in the 1820s and 30s and 40s, there was a whole movement of trying to improve those spaces, planting elm trees, creating more value. In the original days, the common was often just a place where you left your horse when you went to church. So there was, and there were cow commons, and there were commons that were in the middle of the towns that we had this more limited set of uses. Certain citizens had a right to graze their cattle there. So you see these early prints, I think these are from the Barber Series, of different towns where the enhancement is going on. First they've cut down a lot of the trees, and then they've started to grow, here as you see in Branford, Connecticut, young elm trees. And of course those elm trees became a very distinctive part of the American landscape until the great blight of elm trees swept across the country with the arrival of Dutch elm disease. And the cathedral-like settings of so many American cities with these hourglass trees were destroyed. It's probably the single greatest damage to the American landscape that happened in the 20th century. After that initial effort in terms of enhancement, there was another kind of reform period, and that is really starting in the 1890s through the 20s, and was called the City Beautiful movement. It wasn't really started by the World's Fair, but the World's Fair, the White City in Chicago, did have a lot to do with giving people an alternative, and it also, in some ways, froze American architecture into various classical styles. It was an extraordinary change, because I've forgotten now how many millions of Americans went to Chicago, but a huge amount of the country saw the possibility for enhancement, for change, for monumentality, and the result were projects all over the country. Most of these projects were developed by the upper middle class, by the wealthier people in cities and towns, and they were partially a response to the growing concern about crime, about health, about patterns of immigration of people coming into the cities. They were a way of sometimes sanitizing the cities and also defining the great monuments of the city, which would be used by the upper classes. So that was one approach. It was fairly comprehensive. It affected the nation's capital and affected most large cities in America. Can trace some of their more majestic buildings to that period. And here you see, of course, the Burnham Plan. But also in San Francisco, this was a time of big planning, big ideas. And in a way, we look today for maybe a similar kind of set of projects. It'd be nice to think that when President Obama talks about a mandate for infrastructure projects, that we could begin to think boldly about doing some of these vast projects. When you go to Chinese cities today, you see from the airport going into the cities corridors of trees, definition of the cityscape, sometimes crisp edges to the cities. So an understanding and respect for some visual values in a time of great turbulence in their cityscapes. One of the most impressive examples in America was the Franklin Parkway, which was actually promoted by an advertising man in the 1920s who pulled together a coalition to create this great avenue that connects the Art Museum, which you see there on your right, with the fountains of Calder, which are near the City Hall. Of course, this City Beautiful movement was interrupted by the wars, by World War I and World War II. There was a slowdown in development, and you can say that the next real shift in terms of preserving the character of places was the development of the historic districts, and the first one was in Charleston. It was started because in 1 year, Standard of Ohio, an oil company, tore down 3 18th century houses and for gas station sites. And there was such an uproar about that that they created the historic district as a way of combating it. And you can see from this map here how that initial historic district in white has grown so that it really covers the whole lower peninsula. This is where the Ashley and Cooper rivers form the Atlantic Ocean, as Charlestonians would put it. But it's a dramatic change. New Orleans was, I think, the second historic district in the Vieux-Carré. Nantucket and Beacon Hill were the next ones in the 50s. And since that time, there are now over 3,000 historic districts. And they've had quite a profound impact on our way of thinking. They've actually generated a whole group of organizations of historic district commissions, and sometimes regional. There's some regional bodies as well, but mainly they are local districts, often recognized by a national system of historic registration through the Department of the Interior. And I'm sure some of you are aware of that already. But it's had a profound effect. It mainly influenced residential areas. It was really where you had the consensus to make this kind of a change was usually for people who were reasonably well off and had some interest in protecting their property values. So the next movement after that then was to move more into a grittier area to the main streets, and those movements were the Main Street movement, and that's where I came in as a one planner working in that area. But showing you first a few examples of Nantucket. And one of the most interesting exhibits I ever saw was on the Back Bay. It was called The City as a Work of Art. It was at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and it documented this extraordinary district that was created after the Civil War, what had once been 5 to 9 feet of water. Everything from that park that you're seeing there in the foreground on back was a bay. It was dank and it stank, and it was very incrementally, slowly filled in over 40 years, and so this set of mansions were built, which were occupied by people coming down from Beacon Hill, and it was an extraordinary artifact of mankind, and was recognized, I think, as perhaps the most powerful district in the United States in terms of the creation of a total context. So the Back Bay, 1955. But meanwhile, a lot of other places were not as fortunate in having that early preservation. There was a lot of struggling, and this cartoon just illustrates the kind of concern there was around the country where visual values were not respected, trees were cut down, parking lots nibbled away at the edges of green spaces, building lots were taken out for subdivisions, and America was really still deteriorating. And we can see that also in some of the areas of the visual environment, the overhead wires. You can see where we've come from. In some areas there's been enormous improvement. Most new suburbs have underground wires. But right in the middle of the city, like 6th Avenue, you can see what it looked like in the 1880s. And then, of course, they were later underground. Even here in Omaha, you can see the wires were tucked away in the alleys and didn't affect the streets very much. So the Main Street movement really affected the built environment everywhere. I was working on Main Street projects in the early 1970s. The National Trust came in around 1982, I think. And we found places where we could encourage the merchants and property owners to make changes. And it was a very difficult process in many places because people didn't have that much money on Main Street. One of the things they had tried to do was to compete with the shopping centers, and so they had covered the main facades of their buildings with aluminum foil, basically, and plastic and other things, trying to make them look more streamlined. And the result of all that was to take away their distinctiveness and their identity, and they weren't that effective against the sprawl. And so it was this Main Street movement that said, let's go back to finding that identity. And I worked on about 30 of these towns. And I had some good luck in the towns that were poorest because they could get federal money for part of the work. And this one here is Chelsea. It's the poorest per capita community in Massachusetts, and right over the bridge from Boston. And this is the result of street trees and brick sidewalks and gradually changing the facades of the buildings with a series of different kinds of subsidies, using some community money and some private money. We also had a sign takedown day where everybody, the city paid for a truck and a crew, and they went around, as you can see in this picture here, and took down signs, and it gave people a sort of feeling of strength to know they were all doing something at the same time. There was also a television documentary about it, so they knew it was real. I'm being ironic here. And because in a lot of these towns, they really thought they were at the end of the line, and there wasn't much going to happen for them. Since that time, there have been a number of these Main Street affiliated towns with the National Trust, and that served as a kind of learning center, support center, technical advice, and they've also been worked through a number of state programs. And I think this is singularly probably the most effective thing the National Trust has ever done, was to work on the Main Street program. Meanwhile, other things were happening. As you know, the corporate franchise development has expanded, and there are really only a handful of major fast food companies and oil companies that command most of the visual environment at the entryway to cities and towns, and often preempt key corners in the middle of Main Street. And I still think that it's a challenge to work with those companies, and we've come up with some strategies for doing that. Going directly to the top of the corporation and doing a kind of environmental audit of their facilities in hopes of encouraging people to make a change, particularly on areas that are World Heritage sites or could be World Heritage sites. That's a key distinction. And I actually did a book on this subject not too long ago, showing where communities have been able to beat McDonald's up and get something different. And this is an example. It's the only aquamarine McDonald's sign, I think, in the world. It's in Sedona, Arizona, and you see how the shopping center has used the colors of the rose rock and tan rock of Sedona, Arizona, as part of their development. And the McDonald's on the left really fits in. Sorry, it's on the right. I lied to you. And another kind of part of that movement, I think, is to try to encourage companies to do things that are sustainable, that can be used for something else if they are no longer a gas station. We've all seen abandoned gas stations. And of course, early on, Charleston learned about this opportunity because the man who wrote the Historic District legislation, a man named Simmons, was also appointed to be the head of the board, and he was also the architect who designed the stations. We would probably say that was a conflict of interest, but he took the columns of the Manigault house that had been destroyed and actually incorporated them into this gas station. And I can remember in the old days and back in the 60s when it was still a gas station. Now it has been recycled into the shops of the Historic Charleston Foundation. I think it's one of the best examples of a sustainable change of use. But there are not very many that you can find like that. Certainly one of the major issues is having performance standards for landscaping, and so many communities have not done a good job for the big shopping centers, and it's such an obvious kind of thing. And I've looked around for communities that have retrofitted their shopping centers, and this is one example in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Of course, you could say this is in Porter Square, where the Porter Steaks originally came from. Originally, this land was donated as an estate to be a park, and somehow or other it slipped out of the grasp of the city and became a shopping center in the 1950s. And only recently has it's been retrofitted and changed with this parking lot landscape design. But I think it's a kind of the greening of the parking lot. It's part of the greening of America. And I hope we can look to more and more examples like this of tired old lots that are transformed. And sometimes they're transformed with murals as well as by landscaping, as you can see here. Most towns have not had a real strategy for entryways. As you remember, there was a National Endowment for the Art competition a few years ago for city edges. And the idea that you began to think consciously about the entryway to the city, you see here on the left the entryway from Middletown to Newport. Newport prides itself on being a very special part of the world, but the entryway leaves something to be desired. And it's because the two communities don't talk together, even though they both have city managers and staff. There is no conversation. And this is going to be changed as a result of another technique which I encourage you to think about, and that is the idea of having groups of public interest organizations formed together to provide the support for a city or town. And in this case, the Quidnick Island Land Trust, the Preserve Rhode Island, and the Preservation Society for Newport County, which owns the big mansions that some of you have probably seen in Newport, got together with a foundation whose youngest generation are more interested in broader strategies, and they have created a new Scenic Quidnick Alliance. And one of the objectives of that alliance is to underground the wires, to do the edges, to worry about tree planting and various other kinds of planting, flower planting. And I think it's going to make quite a difference in the next few years. But that's a kind of ongoing strategy. The attention of the roadway is something that really requires a lot of effort. And one of the best examples that I know of where you brought the narrative back into a corridor is in Radnor, Pennsylvania, a suburb of Philadelphia, on what is called the main line, or the main line of the railroad. It's an affluent Republican town. I was asked a few years ago to come out there and give a talk about scenic values, and it turned into a 5-year project which involved a 5-mile corridor of roadway in which we came up with a theme, an idea that would link the road together and also provide you information about the origins of Radnor. Radnor, Pennsylvania is named after Radnor in Wales and Radnor Shire. And the idea was to take some of the imagery from Radnor Shire, Wales, and show how it influenced the planning and development of Radnor, Pennsylvania, which was settled by Welshmen. And so we thought about the imagery of the town, and we thought about how the road had been used. It was a Lancaster pike, and it was marked by small stone markers. And we were able to take that idea and bring it up to a highway scale. So you see here on your left-hand side one of these markers. Each mile had a marker. The image of the town seal was carved onto the markers, and then it was also repeated on the 3 bridges of the highway, interstate highway that runs around Philadelphia and through Radnor. It was only the impact of this highway that caused people to start to plan. As you know, Americans seem to wait until the very last moment before they take action. And in this case, the bulldozers were moving through the town. They were creating this roadway, and then people began to think about what do we do to make it a little more attractive, and how do we connect it to the rest of the town. And so the result was a series of public art projects, about 30 of them, which took large rocks and recalled the megalithic landscape of Wales and developed those ideas for the corridor of this roadscape. The largest piece was actually reserved for the connecting highway, the Blue Route. You see the giant dragon, 90 by 100 feet here, done in trap rock by the artist and his family over one broiling hot July weekend. They had to make something like 1,200 knots in the wire, the riprap that goes on top of this stone creation, and it's caused really an incredible concern. I've been back in Radnor, and the town hall often has truck drivers somewhat red-eyed from driving, but they've gone by this thing so many times that they're fascinated by it, and they want to go and find out the story. And one of the things that happened, we received an award for this project because we found there was one of the Stonehenge-like rings that was built as part of the project, an entryway from another adjacent town. One day there was a summer solstice, and black-clad figures showed up to do their rites. And a policeman wrote a report out and said, "Chief, what do I do now?" So it was a piece of unanticipated animation that came out of doing a public art project. But it's been in the National Building Museum and celebrated a number of articles, and it's now taught as a case at the University of Pennsylvania. And I think that it is a good example of the sort of thing that can be done, I think, with a certain amount of ingenuity and a certain amount of attention to the history of a place. And how do you find that information? That is really a kind of a placemaking exercise of gathering the information together and creating some metaphors that the town will support. You can see on the right-hand side here the original milestones that went through the town. It took me several visits before I could find this one, but then you see the clear graphics that we did on these other signs, which are, I think they're about 10 feet high. We also did one large piece, which is being carved here. It's a plinth, and it has all the symbols, all the imagery from this townscape project, which was developed, the original town seal, the dragon, various other elements in one sort of Rosetta Stone of meanings. Unfortunately, we can't find what's happened to it. It was never installed, and it's still down there somewhere waiting to be installed. So I'd have to give myself a B+ grade on this project. Well, the visual assault of the corporations, I think, is something really to be concerned about. And you can see that in the old days, in the bottom picture here, gas stations were often done as little cottages. You probably counted a few of those on the roadside. But then, as people got more and more strident about their marketing, they began to do these very bright colors. And here you can see how that little cottage has been surmounted by a stripe of red. And the Sheets Oil Company at the top of the picture, a Pennsylvania chain, is probably the most blatant. They're convinced that it's their bright color that makes them such an attractive station. And they have begun to grow across the mid-Atlantic and impose these pieces. The current one that I remember most is near Stratford Hall and the Lee family property in Virginia. And I'm not sure you can always embarrass these people into doing the right thing. I think it takes tough zoning, and a lot of the communities don't have it. One of the areas where they are particularly weak, and this is even true of sophisticated communities, is the shelter systems, which are often not regulated by the zoning. If you actually called the shelter colors part of the sign, then you would be able to reduce the amount of signage they could have quite dramatically. They'd have to choose between having a regular sign or having a shelter with always bright colors on it. But very few communities have figured that out yet. But I'm optimistic, as you'll see as we go along, because some communities have done an extraordinary job of regulation. The one on the bottom was the Atlantic Richfield Company, and that's their sign. You can see how small Claremont, California made it. This was actually done by a developer who saw that it was in his interest to do things that were compatible with Claremont, which has the oldest design review law in California. Just some more examples. I did a whole book called Saving Face: How Corporate Franchise Design Can Respect Community Identity. That was putting a positive spin on it, wasn't it? So we contrasted these kinds of things. Of course, they have, and I'm sure you'll recognize it, a certain iconic value. The first McDonald's is like the one on the top here, and it's been restored very proudly by McDonald's. The first one, I think, was in San Bernardino. But my response to that is, okay, let's have one iconic image You can have the old Holiday Inn sign too, which was designed by the chairman's wife. But you know, they don't have to impose all this imagery all across the country. And thank goodness there are a number of communities who have believed that. I'm cheating a little bit here because the one on the left and the top is in England, in Winchester. But the others are adaptive. Two bottom ones are adaptive use. The other one is in Michigan, in Ann Arbor, and it's a new McDonald's. Unfortunately, a house was torn down, and that was put up. So they were required to put something up of a similar scale, has a stained glass window in the middle of it. But you can get some quite remarkable results. This marker sign on the left is the Carmel, California gas station, and they have limited the number of stations they've had in their town by the number of residents and the number of cars, and then they've compressed it down and forced these companies to come up with better designs. And I've watched this wisteria grow over the years, and it's one of my favorite images. The bottom one is in Maine, in Freeport, Maine, and that is adjacent to an old house that was going to be destroyed. And this small town, without the firepower of Omaha, but with a few conservative Yankee citizens who were tough on McDonald's, managed to get this changed where they have a whole flower garden and an indirectly lit sign. I love the idea of even having artists involved. Now this is the kind of cutting edge. This is in Ojai, California, which is an arts community. There was a regular shiny porcelain paneled gas station there, and a couple of years ago they were able to totally change the station, and they incorporated the work of artists not only on the inside, on the outside, but on the inside. And as you can see, all kinds of things can be done differently. Even some modest little things like an ATM machine can be done differently. This is in Charlottesville, Virginia. So corporate control of the visual environment with the corporations is, I think, a growing phenomena. Because there are an increasing number of historic districts and design review districts that are not even related to history, particularly in California, I'm optimistic that there'll be more changes that will be done. And in some cases, the companies have changed their prototypes in order to adapt to places that are more restrictive, and that's true in England. The McDonald's in England are done with dark slate roofs, and they're really quite different phenomena. Related to the corporate branding is the fact that so many of our American communities looked very generic, and this can also be the fault of some of the planners and designers that were working there. This community here, I think this is Eugene, Oregon, did a mall, a downtown mall in the 1960s, in which this concrete tank trap called a water element, you can see some landscape designer drawing this, a piece of new brutalism, was fitted into the main street, the main intersection. Of course, after a few months, the water didn't work anymore, and it just became an eyesore. And finally, a woman ran against this project for mayor, and she, in the I guess it would be about 2000, came in and won the election, and they bulldozed this thing, and they put in 4 corners, you see 2 of them here, in the same location, which tell a story about the cultural sites and attractions in this community and also around this community. So, and this was done by a team of artisans. And I had nothing to do with this. I'd used the example in my book, earlier book, of the kinds of terrible things that were happening in American spaces, how they never became places. They were going to forever be just spaces. And then I came back and saw this kind of development. I thought, well, we're on the right side of history, that these kinds of things can happen and they will happen if enough attention is paid. And so that's another reason for my qualified optimism. Placemaking strategies. Well, you start with the cultural landscape, what's going on in the minds of people, and that's what those artists had done there. They found the things that people recalled about the place. knowing something about the physical context so that what you impose is not overburden the place. This has been a tremendous issue in the development of public art in America, where a lot of works of public art were chosen by curators working under the National Endowment for the Arts, for example, and they were dropped into spaces all around the country. And what they did was a preemptive strike on ever doing another piece of art there, because people were so annoyed by these pieces that they didn't want to have any more art. And there was no evaluation system with the NEA grants, so the people, well-meaning people that were giving the money, wanted to think they were really the good guys, and they didn't want to know that a lot of people resented what they were doing. This is even true of famous artists. In fact, it can often be true of people who want to make a point. Like the high rust mark of this attitude was a piece in New York City by the Federal building downtown. It was a Corten steel arc by Richard Serra, a very distinguished American artist, which went across the plaza, so you couldn't use it. It basically, you had to confront the art. And that was considered, among 5,000 people in Manhattan, as an extremely interesting idea. But for the judges who used the building, 900 of them signed a petition asking for it to be removed. At which point there was this huge struggle with artists lining up behind Richard Serra saying you have to have the freedom of expression, and then behavioralists and traditional artists saying, no, this is a mistake, you've destroyed the space for people. And it was a 3-day hearing, and one artist even came up with the idea that the arc had musical qualities, and it was a good backdrop for performances. But despite this ingenuity, the judges and lawyers in the building prevailed, and the piece was taken down. And then there was a kind of fight over where it should go, and to move it is to destroy it. Well, in the end, I think it has a happy home in a park, an art park up the Hudson, but it was not appropriate in this place, according to most of the people. And it caused a serious reevaluation of how public art is developed and commissioned, both with the General Services Administration and the National Endowment for the Arts. And if they had done some of these kinds of points here, I think that they would have come up with a different result. They would have thought about how the space was being used by people. They would have thought about complexities of use. They would have thought about building pride and proprietorship. People were, frankly, using the wall for other purposes, you can imagine. And so that was the high rust mark. And since that time, they've added more community people to these juries, and there's been more of a respect for the actual place. So a difference between public art and art in public places. A lot of the things that can be done are modest, and a lot of them can be achieved by using a 1% or 2% for public art. So that's a whole other kind of movement that runs through a concern for the visual environment. And we were able in Chelsea to do this sculpture on the right, which is of a Afro-American kid and a science teacher in the local high school, both of whom had some heroic characteristics to them. And there's a small girl, the sculptor, on the right, small daughter of the sculptress on the right. But this piece was done using a percentage which we didn't call public art. This is a tough blue-collar city, so we called it pedestrian orientation. And it worked very well. And there were inlays in the pavement. There were little pieces next to the bus stop that like a purse that someone would try to grab, and then people would tell a story about it. There were bronze inlays. There was a memory wall. I think I have that in here. Well, somewhere I do. So it blended with interpretation. It blended with information about the place. And many of these actions have created a whole different sense of value for people. These are other examples of such things that also have a kind of respect and animation. The one on the far right is a hopscotch by the old City Hall, and that's where Benjamin Franklin went to school. It was the Boston Latin School, and so the kids actually played this 18th century game on the street. So this piece tied in with a Freedom Trail, which moves through the whole city, so it becomes an element in the Freedom Trail. And I've actually watched people playing hopscotch here. Just one modest insertion. I'm not saying that any of these things are going to save the world. I'm just saying they add a richness and complexity to place, which builds up a feeling of proprietorship and a connection to people. And the new graphics, the fact that there are so many more elegant ways of using interpretation today that weren't available 50 years ago, I mean that you don't have to have these dull bronze or aluminum plaques. You can do things with graphics, with old photographs, mixtures of cutouts that are quite extraordinary. And the picture on your right, on the lower side, is actually a walk through a water treatment plant where the artist was commissioned to work with the new water treatment plant and took the issue of the politics of water and did a whole series of quotes about the struggle over water in Southern California. So it's a very memorable piece and a very modest budget. Even a bike rack can be done with humor and whimsy, as you can see here, or a drinking fountain, like the one on the right. This drinking fountain is in Cambridge, and it's on Fresh Pond, where water was a resource used for freezing. In the wintertime, they used the ice. They combined it with apples and sent it to India and made 2 fortunes. And across the way from this is the actual water treatment building. And when you drink the water here, you look in a window and see a tube of water and there's a little droplet of water that changes, so you know that you're having an effect on the water supply. Again, the things that artists can add to our lives are so rich and variable, and they need to be thought about in a systemic way in the way we plan. The one on the bottom on your left is actually a tree guard in Louisville, Kentucky, on the main street. And in Kentucky, there are a lot of people who sit on porches whittling sticks. It's one of the things they do in Kentucky. And so this is a series of those wooden canes that have been cast in bronze. The piece on the right celebrates the farmers markets, the fact that all over America there are new farmers markets, so this becomes the kind of framework for the market. That's in Olympia, Washington. Well, education is a large part of the strategy of improving our visual environment, and you're just looking here at my lifetime's output of books on the various subjects of the environment, the greens and commons, building facades, getting people more involved with those, the placemaking I talked about earlier, looking at an American town and seeing how it changes over time for school children, the book on the corporate alternatives, which is kind of a visual empowerment guide for communities that are trying to change McDonald's. You find all the good ones. Out of all of these things, Scenic America has developed a set of principles, and they are designed to help any community, no matter how besotted with billboards or covered with the tin cans of phony facades of the 1950s. It's not so much about where you are now, but what you can do with these principles. And so I'll go over the principles briefly and illustrate them. And you can read as well as I do, and I actually loathe people who read their slides, so you can just see that. But the example on the bottom is Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh was a city that was, as you know, benighted for many years with its steel plants, and the pollution was so great that you couldn't keep a shirt white after half a day. But it's changed. Of course, the steel mill industry, steel production has gone way down, and the city has had the strength with its foundations to landscape, create paths along the river. They've created a very distinctive sense of community. So among the things that you have to think about under this principle are setting aside open space for greenways and parks and trails and river corridors. And you can think only of a few American communities that have done a good job with the ultimate thing, which is green belting. Boulder, Colorado comes to mind. The growth zones in the state planning law in Oregon, for example, are examples of trying to create crisp edges to places. Protecting farms and ranches from subdivision with agricultural zoning and conservation land trust. The growth of the conservation land trust is another one of the great happy phenomena of the last 25 or 30 years. Some of them started in New England in little towns, and they're now, I think, over 3,000 land trusts. They have a meeting on Land Trust Alliance. It'd be a useful thing for some of you students to go to those meetings and see how that movement has grown in the country. And then, of course, creating incentives for growth in cities and older towns, as obviously the objective is to create compact, transit-oriented, pedestrian-friendly, mixed-use communities. That's quite a line. Then new development that respects the special character of places. Well, we've spoken about that already with some of the corporate examples, but there are so many other things that can be done. We need to think about incorporating aesthetics into performance standards for siting buildings. I talked earlier about the parking lots. You can make a dramatic change by changing the parking lots of shopping centers. And of course, there's more of a rationale for doing it now because of the better knowledge about the runoff from water and the need for creating a better drainage system that doesn't create so much runoff. You as students are probably involved in identifying and mapping the visual qualities of cities, and that's part of the strategy, is to make each city understand what's special about it, and that should be part of their general plan. Obviously, community tree policies are very important. There's a new elm tree, you should all know that has now been developed, which can sustain or overcome the elm blight, which was Dutch elm disease. That's only a recent development, but the idea of having strategies for urban design strategy for trees, not just the incremental planting of trees, but replacing trees over time, thinking about tree damage during construction of buildings. Some of the things we saw yesterday when we were looking around Omaha, where the trees are already dying. There wasn't a good strategy. There was too much compaction, the soil was wrong. So these grand gestures can go astray if there's not really a sensitive policy in that regard. Well, scenic resources, land stewardship. This is an area where there can be a lot of incentives, and one of the most recent interesting ones has been in Virginia, where the state's tax credit program, which is operating statewide, obviously, in only 9 years has generated over 2,000 individual land conservation donations, protecting 434,000 acres of land. And the appraised value of that land is over $2.2 billion, and it represents more than $970 million in tax credits. So that's a way of applying the donation against your state tax, your state income tax is a fascinating approach. The highway corridor, we've spoken about the need to create a greater meaning in these corridors, and there are very few transportation departments that have thought very much about that. Engineers, for the most part, have had a very simplistic and sort of standard approach to things, and so working with these highway departments can be difficult. I know because I was involved in mano a mano with the department in Pennsylvania, which did change. We were able to, through the town of Radnor, we were able to ensure that the work of the artists was covered by the insurance of the town. That was one of the big worries that they had. The idea of doing anything different was hard for them to accept, but now they've gotten various awards for this project, and I think the possibility of doing more things like this has increased. In Colorado, they've done some interesting things. Arizona also has done sensitive projects, particularly in Scottsdale and in Phoenix, highway corridors. One of the greatest developments was the National Scenic Byways Program, which is part of the U.S. Department of Transportation, Federal Highways Administration. And this has meant identifying scenic roadways around the United States. And since 1992, which is when this program was first developed, there have been more than 3,000 projects for state and nationally designated byways in all 50 states. And there's even been a scenic highway center. which unfortunately has not been funded for this year so far, so we're a little in doubt about that. This example here is one of the scenic bridges that was in the Acadia National Park, originally a riding trail for the Rockefeller family. This is the one I think where we've done had least effect, and that is with the billboards. There was something called the Highway Beautification Act. I'm sure you've read about that under President Johnson. Lady Bird Johnson was very adamant that she wanted to see billboards removed, and Johnson lent his voice to this. But at the very last minute, the billboard people, as the bill was being signed, managed to put in a feature requiring compensation. So you get compensation for the lost income that you would have off a billboard, even though the billboard only has most of its value because it's on a public investment. It's on a highway. If you turned its back to the highway, it wouldn't be worth very much. It would only be worth the value of the framework. So they got rid of the amortization clause that would have just allowed you to phase these things out over a period of years, and then the Congress never funded the compensation. So you were caught in this situation. And as a result of that, there has not been really substantial progress. There are a few states that use their own monies and were able to buy out the signs right away. And those are Maine and Vermont and Hawaii. But it's not been very successful elsewhere. Now, there are a number of things that can be done. One is to promote well-designed logos and sign directional systems, and Maine and Vermont have done that very well, which tell you where things are, so you take away the need for the clutter of other signs. Also, there needs to be a regulation of outdoor advertising. That now they're wrapping buildings with these things, and of course that actually has some health and safety consequences. And the most recent problem has been the growth of the digital signs, which is now being contested by Scenic America. There's a lawsuit, which I can tell you about, is just going forward, to challenge the very definition of what is a digital sign, of a repeating sign. The companies, supported to some extent politically in the Department of Transportation, have been trying to say that anything that doesn't change more than 8 seconds is not a changeable sign. And if that definition holds, then all over the country they'll be going forward with these digital signs. In fact, there have already been a certain number of them that have been put up. So that is kind of the high watermark of that issue, and I think that we're going to prevail, again, using the benefits of a university law center. The Georgetown Legal Center is taking on this case and challenging the definition, and also challenging the Department of Transportation to reveal a study that was done, a study that was done all over the world on billboards, and it pointed out that in fact they were not a very effective way of advertising, and that the other countries banned this digital signage. And once that report was finished, the billboard industry realized they were in danger, and so they've tried to suppress the report. So between the suppressing of the report and an administrative ruling that changing the sign character every 8 seconds is not a changeable sign, a lot of damage is being done. And one of the things that I think Scenic America is going to be making a difference on will be to try to change that, and that's just going forward right now. Obviously, there's also the problem of cellular communications and utility and energy generation technologies. There have been some interesting examples of hiding cellular towers as trees. I don't think it's fooled many of you, but they do look a little bit better on some of the scenic roads. Some communities have done well with billboard regulation, and one of the most interesting examples is the city of Houston, which had more than 10,000 billboards in 1980 when they passed a new law which banned new billboards. Now they're down to about 1,500 billboards because of the changes in property development. And it's very interesting that the conservative property owning class in Houston have supported this. And one of the reasons they've supported it is because there were a number of people that they couldn't recruit to come to live in Houston, partially based on the fact that it was so ugly. So it was in people's own self-interest to make these kinds of changes. And Scenic America has worked with Scenic Houston on this project, and I think it's one of the more fascinating examples, and one that gives us some hope that other cities will do the same. Obviously, trying to build this component of visual value into our school systems is a major manifesto item. And there are some good examples of this. The one you see on the screen is Scenic Philadelphia partners with Philadelphia Futures, and that is a group of school children and teachers that are building projects, kind of community planning projects, like the one I actually audited today here, into the high schools, so that there are a number of places where children are allowed to come up with different solutions to building projects in neighborhoods. And the result of that has been, again, a sense of proprietorship and ownership. And this has been in what we would consider to be economically deprived areas, as you can perhaps conjure up from looking at the photograph. One of the things that we're trying to do, and the final thing, is to engage business community. The seventh principle is to engage the businesses and the professional organizations in this movement. And the idea of corporations taking a pledge where they agree they will not use billboards. And we're just beginning that with a few companies. And this is one from Pittsburgh, where we had our meeting. Whenever we have a meeting, we like to have some of the businessmen in that community come step forward and make a pledge. And that's a slow process. There are a lot of people who don't use billboards themselves, but some of their clients use billboards. And as you know, corporate leadership is sometimes rather timid. But I think we're going to make some progress with this. So America can, I think, to many of us, be a place that is ugly, that we need to mature as a society, that we have not made as many inroads in this area as we'd like to. But on the other hand, I think I pointed out with the Main Street movement, with the historic district movement, with the land use, with the land trusts, that there are many areas that are positive and where a lot of changes happened in the last 30 years. And I'm hoping that this generation coming out of the schools are more involved with authenticity, with interest in organic food, with interest in coming to our senses, of living back in cities, of finding places that have quality to them, both quality in terms of the landscape, but also in terms of the human meaning of the places, that all of these instincts and urges will lend a strength to this movement and will allow it to claim a greater policy place in American life. And so I hope that you will join with me in a dedication to this cause. And I have the 7 principles down here, a copy or two if you'd like to have them. So I thank you very much for your attention. I'm ready to take some questions, and please don't hold back if you see something ugly that you want to talk about. Cheers.
Questions on the videotape, so if you've got a question, I've got the mic for you here.
And I'll repeat the question, if needs be. Yes, the yellow shirt.
Has Scenic America done anything with dealing with wind turbines, wind energy?
Yeah, they've started to talk about it. I know that's a big issue here in Nebraska, and the idea of kind of zoning them into certain areas and not others, we had a big fight over the Nantucket Sound in Massachusetts, and David McCullough, the historian, rose up in a fury against these signs, but it's not signs, against these turbines. But unfortunately, it looks like they're going to be putting them into the Sound. We lost that particular battle. I don't think there's a clean answer to this. I think that the positive thing, I think, is to identify the things that are special and to make people more aware of what they are. So it means taking the skills of the School of Architecture in terms of analysis and identifying all through the state the things that are important and trying to get that publicly accessible. I think one of the problems is that as people who have certain skills, we're better at doing the analysis than we are at doing the advocacy. And I think I was speaking about this the other day. You remember that in Dublin, to celebrate the Georgian architecture of Dublin, which at one point was very threatened, people did posters, and they had like the doors of Dublin. They had these beautiful doors. And something that had been bulldozed in many neighborhoods, people could see had value. And the idea of taking the perspectives of Nebraska, the great movements, whether it's Chimney Rock or something else, looking at all those things that are special about Nebraska and doing them in a graphically compelling way so that the legislature would agree that there would be zones around those particular areas. I don't think we're going to be able to stop or should stop all of these turbines, but I think it's a matter of trying to make people aware of certain areas and precincts where they shouldn't be allowed. Yes. Another question?
Sir, is anything being done to lessen the roadkill?
To reduce the roadkill? Not sure how to answer that question. You mean the roadkill that as a result of our using the highways? Yep. Well, I can't think of other than, that stumps me, I must say. I think we all have a joke about the Roadkill Cafe, and I don't think we're going to have any special licensing program for restaurants that use roadkill. But I do think that that sometimes freshly killed deer on the street have a practical and economic use. But I can't help you with the roadkill. Maybe someone else here has an idea.
In Europe, they're much more aware of animal rights, it seems.
Oh, I see what you mean.
And so they put in grates and all sorts of protections for the animals so that there's habitat, and we respect the habitat for animals, especially wild animals, in creating our community.
Well, that's a very interesting idea. I was just came back a couple of days ago from northern Wales, and my guide was talking about the hedgerows and how one of the problems in terms of the visual environment over there was people cutting the hedgerows too tightly and destroying the habitat for the birds. So in a sense, that's kind of one kind of answer, one kind of sensitivity. We don't have the same kind of hedgerow system with our agriculture.
Those principles might be incorporated into Scenic America principles as well. I think it would certainly tell us that we are not only individuals, but individuals within a community of plants and animals.
Well, that's eloquently said, and I will bring this back to our committee and see whether we can use any language that relates to the larger kingdom that we're in. That's an interesting point, and I was pretty unaware of it. Yes.
So obviously, a lot with what you deal with, there's a lot of politics involved with working with fast food industries and gas stations and stuff. Obviously, there's the city of Houston has the power to kind of fight against
Mm-hmm.
however you stated them. And what can small towns do to, to avoid getting bullied around by, fast food joints or?
That's a really good question. The corporate bullying, well, if you don't do what we say, we're going to bring our lawyers in here tomorrow, and most of these towns have very limited resources for advocacy. I guess one answer to that is to try to come together with other communities so that you have some strength in numbers. I know that in Chicago, which isn't a little town, but there they did a kind of consolidated look at what McDonald's wanted to do, and instead of letting McDonald's defeat them on a block by block basis, they forced McDonald's to negotiate for all of their restaurants in the city at the same time, and they developed a set of design standards for those restaurants. So that's kind of one example. That doesn't help the small town, but it shows one way of dealing with corporate power. And I think that to the extent that a Conference of Mayors, League of Cities group can focus on something like that and work with a variety of towns. Also, of course, there are groups like Scenic America that can help some of these communities. We've fought some lawsuits in the past on behalf of communities, not for McDonald's, but for on the billboard issue. So that's kind of an incomplete answer. I think that the bullying power of corporations is a huge issue in the country, and I would be dishonest if I said there were an easy answer to that. I've seen some towns though that have one, and basically, I guess the answer to that is that if the corporation really wants to be in that location, and you hang tough, they're there to sell a product, and they will change if they really want to be there. Now, I've been in several communities where we've developed standards for McDonald's. In one case, they went away, and in other cases, they have cooperated because they saw that their own long-term economic interest was to sell their hamburgers. So the cost of their doing something that was a little different from what their marketing department had stipulated was marginal in terms of their larger economic presence and effort. And so in those cases, it really depends on location. And I know that towns have been, of course, some of the towns that have done this have been wealthier towns. Palm Springs, California, I think, just waited them out. They waited for 7 years, and finally McDonald's did a store that's right up against the street with the parking behind. It has a plaster M in the front of the building, not an independent sign. So it worked. Now that's a town that has a resort business and has a stronger sense of the importance of its image than a lot of towns. So again, I'm stacking the deck a little bit here. But there are enough examples of that to say that really corporate behavior is really all about getting their product in there. And if you can hang tough, in the end, they will want to have a store location if it makes good economic sense. There's one in the back there. Go ahead in the back, and then we'll do the one in the front.
Okay. I was going to ask, what grade would you give Nebraska as far as scenic preservation?
Oh, there's a question. And here I am, my first day, a guest of the university, perhaps even getting an honorarium. What do I say? Well, I've had, Rich Sutton has been so gracious. I've gone around and looked at Omaha for 2 hours, so I have some sense of how you get in and out of Omaha. And I arrived here in the darkness, but I've looked around a little bit. I would say there's a lot of work left to be done. I think there's some things that are easier to do than others. Again, I think the consistent tree planting is a doable kind of urban design strategy that could be done. And I know that the university in its wisdom has hired a respected landscape design firm from Massachusetts, which is going to be coming up with a strategy for hierarchies for spaces and creating, I think, more lushness between buildings. And So on the university level, I think there's some promise. I'd say that there's some bleakness out there on the prairie, and that it's not an easy thing when you have this plethora of space. When you all around you see space to begin to say, well, this space is really more important, and we need to respect it. That's why I'm thinking that the strategy of propaganda, of using some of the graphic skills of the university to articulate the values, is one way of going about this and showing how important they are. And again, I think showing befores and afters can have devastating effect. I think we are maturing as a society. I guess I'll make a summary statement about that. And that just as I see people enjoying themselves, coming to their senses, as I mentioned earlier, having a much greater appreciation for their personal life as individuals in a city or a place, caring for their bodies and their souls, that I think our issue becomes more important. And I think this is the generation that should be leading the charge. And although I'm not overwhelmed by the Nebraska landscape, I think there are those that love it. And one of the things I understood almost immediately was that in every neighborhood there is a love of place. Whether it's having a barbecue with your neighbors, there's something that ties people to neighborhoods. And there's enormous friendliness out here, enormous sense of empathy, which I discovered in just 24 hours. And it's that strength which binds people to a place. And it's out of that energy of place that the changes can be made. Does that partially answer you?
Yeah.
Good. There was one in the front you had.
Yeah,
That's for the video.
oh, that's for the video, okay. I've been in a couple of cities that were really towns that have had historic districts, small towns, Oxford, Mississippi, a place in Texas that has a huge number of historic buildings. But in both those instances, there's a modern autoscape.
An autoscape, you said.
An autoscape, the whole commercial
Right, so the
district.
question really is,
So
towns
we
of
have-
historic character juxtaposed against the autoscape, right?
And the autoscape is the real place
Right.
of America. That's the real streetscape. It's the real townscape in a sense.
Well, there are
It's
places
the one
that
that's
have,
everywhere. And
yeah,
I think that's the corporate problem. Is it not?
it is.
How do you address that?
Well, again, some of the newer cities have been able to address it better than old ones. Thousand Oaks, California, for example, is designed around, strip commercial. And yet they have been able to transform their strip commercial with landscape corridors, with monument sales signs, with design review of individual buildings. So they haven't changed the module, they haven't changed the scape, they've just refined it and actually created more legibility. And I was so interested by this approach that I did a little value study and found that the property values were higher in that area where there was restraint on these things, but there was still an acceptance of that streetscape or autoscape than there were in the surrounding towns. And I think as America gets retrofitted, as more and more places are transformed, like that parking lot I showed you in Porter Square in Cambridge, which was an eyesore for 40 years, that those values are recognized, that we're not going to get rid of the shopping center, we're not going to get rid of the car right away, we're going to bring back some rapid transit, as Los Angeles is doing, with 80 miles costing billions of dollars when they had 2,000 miles 100 years ago, or 70 years ago. So there's a certain amount of toilet training for the American population that's been slow to develop. But there are lots of places in the world that are using automobiles that don't have the same smear that we do. I spent a lot of time in Switzerland. Their cities are crisp on the edge. You even go from the airport in London and you're affected by the Town and Country Planning Act of 1967. So again, I think it's a question of political will, and it's a question of raising expectations. I asked an English planner once why they were able to make these radical changes after World War II, and they said the very impact of the war showed people that they could make enormous change, for good as well as for evil. and that they were able, that they then had the political will to do it. In America, we haven't had that political will. We've had the idea that you can build your house anywhere you want. In the countryside in Europe, you can't build a house on 3 acres. You have to have a foundation where there was a house before. The countryside in many places is sacrosanct, and there are tight zoning envelopes around each development. And in Switzerland, they're squeezing them down. So again, it's a matter of the competence of the planners supported by the will of the people. And I think we have to do a better job to communicate the importance of these values if we're ever going to achieve, use our skills effectively.
Thank you.
Great.